the body and speech is what harms each other, and isn't it? So the first level of practice for Lord Buddha, junior school, first scope of the Lam Rim, is back off and don't harm others. It's not complicated, you know. Then he gets to begin to look at our minds. Now you can go to high school, and now you become a Buddhist. You really become a Buddhist. This is where the unique approach of Lord Buddha, because look at that. Good Christians will not kill and lie. Good communists will not kill and lie. Good Buddhists, good Muslims, good whatever you like. That's common to any halfway decent human being. So that's not uniquely Buddhist. Buddha's view is kind of unique, the view of karma, let's say, his understanding of it. But when you get to high school, that's where you get to uniquely Buddha's approach. That's where you become a Buddhist. His view about the mind, how it functions. And that means you have to know, what does he mean by a negative state? What does he mean by a positive? What does he mean by a neutral? These are not how we think in the West. The words are simple. Love, compassion, oh yeah, I know those. Anger, jealousy, yeah, I know those. But that's not the stuff of modern psychology. It sounds too cute. But this is the stuff of Buddhist psychology, and it hasn't changed in 2,500 years. So either they're stubborn and they won't change, or it works, you know. So understanding our mind, understanding our mental consciousness. This is where we go to high school, having controlled our body and speech, having lived in vows, having purified our mind by controlling our body and speech. Now we can really start to do the real job based on concentration and meditation, learn Buddhist psychology, go deep inside and unpack and unravel the contents of this mind of ours. That's the hard job. That sounds easy, the words, and it is. But to do it and succeed at it takes enormous hard work, enormous discipline, enormous clarity, enormous effort, on the basis of living in vows and controlling your body and speech. You can't do it without that. So if you graduated at high school, which is the first wing of the bird, the wisdom wing, that's all we've talked about all week, and we're still talking only about that, junior school and high school, you'd control your body and speech, live in vows, purify your mind, go to high school, understand concentration. You could do that earlier if you wanted. Learn Buddhist psychology, go into your mind, unpack and unravel, and eventually rid the mind of all the rubbish, get renunciation, keep going, realize emptiness, cut the root of samsara, and then in one particular life you get your nirvana, and then you're done, you're cooked, and that life you won't come back, baby. You're finished. Bye, I'm going. You leave samsara. You've achieved your own nirvana. You achieved your own liberation. So like I said, the Theravadins would say that you're gone completely. There's nothing left. But as His Holiness said one time, it was so cute and sweet how he said it, we Mahayanas have a problem with that. It's so easy when he said it. The Mahayana view is your mind will continue. So what they say is that when you've achieved your nirvana, you've cut the root of all suffering. You've done the job. You're out of here by high school. What you do is you don't disappear. You go to a subtle state of bliss. And you stay there for a few eons. And then Buddha comes along and taps you on the shoulder and says, okay, baby, get out of this bliss now. Come back into the Mahayana path and become a Buddha so you can help others. That's what they say. All right? Okay, good. Okay, everybody? I don't need to give you a break yet. Do you want a tea break or something? Do you want a wriggle break? Stand up, have a break. What do you want? It's 11:30. I've been talking non-stop for 50 minutes, 60, 70 minutes, 80 minutes. Do you want me to stop now and have a break? Or you want to ask questions now?
Would you like a break?
No, I'm happy. I don't mind talking. You can see that. I'm processing it all for myself, so thank you very much. So do you have any questions so far? I'm trying to give an overview of everything. Do you understand? Any questions so far? Yes, darling. What's your question?
When you say that I'm the boss,
yes,
and I'm trying to, on the other hand, trying to disengage with the whole idea of I. So how do I?
That's right. There's no contradiction. We'll get there when we talk about emptiness. I know it sounds contradictory, but it's not. And that's a real subtle point. We'll get to it when I talk about emptiness. Any other questions? No. So let's go back to the experience. So this is what I'm talking about here. The I consciousness sees shape and colour. Yes, go down.
I have a question which is not coming from ego at all, but in Hinduism there's this whole school, the Vedanta school, right? Which I only encountered very recently, which sounds exactly like a lot of this, where I mean, it was exciting to be told there's no God.
I understand.
It's only
I understand that. Yes, right? Good. Yes. Right. So the question is, what's the difference?
No, so Hinduism is very confusing with all the gods and
goddesses. There's
many.
Well, go on. What's the question?
Well, it's not a question. I'm just sharing, and I want to know what you.
Well, you have a question. Try and ask me the question. It's good if you can get it to the question because it gets to the essence.
Okay.
If you haven't got the question clear yet, let's wait.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, go on.
So do you, I mean, to me, the Vedanta path sounds exactly like the foundation
I understand
of
that.
Buddhism,
I understand that. I understand
and
that.
Yet Hinduism seems like this big mess till you actually go to that secret part, which is excitingly rid of belief, and faith, and God.
I understand that.
And a creator.
So the question?
So the question, do you still describe Hinduism as believing in the creator? Because to me, when I discovered this...
I understand that.
Yeah.
I understand that. I understand that. The point is this. The point is the philosophical position. This is where we have to get to emptiness. And it sounds just like an intellectual point, but it's genuinely experiential. Buddha's, okay, there are many, okay. Okay. Let's just leave it for now and we'll get there slowly, but even what I'm saying now already is the point. So what I'm getting at here, when I even look at the cup, it'll all come, we'll get there, okay? So now, if we look at this cup, like I said before, eye consciousness merely sees shape and colour. This is already giving us incredible insight into the way the mind works. And all of this has come from all these Hindu teachings. This is why there's so much similarity in linking, but I'll get to the point. So, basically this view is saying, the Buddhist view here, and probably the view you're saying, whatever, is that then if all my eye consciousness cognizes just merely shape and colour, then all the rest of it, cup, even the view that it's a cup, it's this, it's pretty, it's ugly, all of this is in the mental consciousness. So this is the point now, what's in the mental consciousness is thoughts. So a pretty cup is a series of thoughts. What is a thought? A thought is a construct. A thought is an opinion. A thought is a viewpoint. So the point is, everything in the mental consciousness is a viewpoint, a conceptual construction, something that we have made up. So not only that's a pretty cup, but even more shockingly, that's a cup. That's also merely a viewpoint. It's an opinion. So the Buddha's saying, really roughly speaking, this is my way of putting it, all the negative ones are viewpoints, and the positive ones are viewpoints. So he is saying, roughly speaking, the positive ones, the virtuous ones, are reasonable viewpoints, which means they're viewpoints that have some extent in sync with reality. But the negative ones, there's no connection whatsoever with reality. They're viewpoints, but they don't, there's some basis, you could say, but they're basically misconceptions. They're wrong viewpoints. The thought has no relationship to reality. And this is what he is saying across the board. Across the board. So, you can easily say, no, that's an ugly cup, Robina, and then we can have a war about it. It's obvious it's a viewpoint, ugly cup or pretty cup. But to start to discuss the actual cupness, that sounds a surprise to us. We think that's a fact. We think it's a fact that's a cup. Well, even this view, that's expressed in the teachings you're describing, the non-duality teachings, the Buddha finally, where he diverged from even all the Hindu teachings, and this is even still in the Buddhist view, there are different viewpoints. That the view that we're describing in this room, which is the view of the middle way view of the Mahayana teachings, not the Theravadan, because even in Buddhism there are different views about what exists and what doesn't. And that's really kind of subtle. There are so many Indian views and there are so many Buddhist views. If you really study all this stuff, it's highly complex. Because finally what we're talking about is finally what exists and what doesn't. Finally, ultimately, what exists and what doesn't. So you can hear from what you're saying, there are indeed some of the Indian teachings that would say even no God. But still, even in the Buddhist teachings, Buddha would say, some of the earlier views, the Theravadan views, even some of the Mahayana views, there's still a view that there is something there. There is something there that makes it that. So the Madhyamika Prasangika view, as they call it, which is the view of the middle way, which is the Mahayana view, which is the view called the consequentialist middle way, just giving it a label for this view that I'm describing here, which is said to be the actual view of the Buddha, is that there is not one single atom of anything there that makes it that. These are the simple words for it. Listen, they study this stuff for 40 years in the monasteries and then go meditate for another 40 on this. So it's all a question of view, of degree of what exists and what doesn't. So the classic one of the Hindu position would be that there is finally some Atman, a self. There's something there. These amazing Indian yogis, these genius beings, came from their own inner work to a conclusion that there is something there called an Atman, a self, which is either permanent, it has parts, or it doesn't have parts. There's all these different positions, they're viewpoints from yogis' minds. And then there's all these discussions. So there's those different viewpoints. In the Indian ones, there must be so many. As you're just stating, there is even one that says there isn't even the one of an external creator. But still, then you get to the Buddhist view where Buddha diverges. Even the earlier Buddhist schools, they say there is something there. Then the next school says there's a bit less than that. And the next one says there's a bit less than that. And the next one says there's a bit less than that. And then fine, but there's always still something. And it gets ever more subtle, ever more subtle. And finally, this view that we're describing in this room, from the teachings I've heard from my teachers, that the Prasangika Madhyamika view, there is not one atom of anything there. So there's just a way of saying it. But everything finally is a viewpoint. And the job that Buddha says we have to all do is find out what's a true viewpoint, what's true and what's not. And it's not a question of believing what's true and what's not. We have to work it out. We have to decide. Okay, we can take instructions. So all of it comes down to what exists and what doesn't. And all of Buddha's teachings are discussing that. All the stuff we've talked about so far this week about karma and the mind are leading to this one, which is the final realization of emptiness. And this is what Buddha's saying. When we finally have seen this, and I'm going to discuss it all, what it means, these words, unpack these words, because we have many fantasies about what emptiness means, you know. We finally can see the truth, the reality, the fact of what is existing and what's not. That's what Buddha says is liberation. That is liberation. So even this word liberation is used by all the different views. Everyone's got a different view, and you're allowed to have a different view. All we can do is we have to find out what's true and what's not. That's all. And that's what our job is. You with me? Yeah. Yes.
I was curious to know, what is the Mahayana Buddhist view of the Big Bang theory?
Oh, darling, it's a perfect... I mean, the Big Bang is... Well, I'll tell you what His Holiness said. He says, in all his discussions with all the scientists, he says, Big Bang, no problem. Just not the first Big Bang, that's all. There's lots of big bangs, you know. Of course there are big bangs. There's always a start of something. There's a relative start to that camera. There's a relative start to you. There's a relative start to this. But what we tend to desperately want is a first complete start. Big bang first start. And that's where the Christians or the Hindus who believe in some source, they say that's the start, but that didn't have a start. If you're a smarty pants in school, you'll say, who made God? And they'll tell you to be quiet. So this is the philosophical view that Buddha's describing. And how come his view is we don't need a start. The things are beginningless, which sounds a bit shocking to us, because we want big bangs. We want a first moment. We want a creator. And our mind makes that up, Buddha says. And he's saying it's a misconception. Do you understand? So this is what's... You know, these views are all valid viewpoints. And if we really study, and they do in the Tibetan monasteries, they study all these different views, all the different positions. And you meditate on all of these to really try to find the truth of them, and then you keep going and going and going. That's how they say, you know. You with me? So it's up to us to find out. Not a question of believing. It was hard work. This is super intense hard work, you know. Yes?
What about this quantum physics, this discovery of God particles and all that? So
who particles?
God particles.
I have no idea what that means. I don't know what a God
so
particle
it's
is.
like they're going to, you have atom, then you have nucleus,
Yes. Yes.
Electron, proton,
Yes.
neutron, all that. So going smaller and smaller.
Yeah, that's right. And the conclusion from this?
So the conclusion is that if the way you say that there is no atom, there's nothing.
You can no one. Yeah, go on.
So eventually, do you mean to say that this kind of a search would eventually lead to this thing that there is nothing to it, and is that the view of emptiness?
Well, you could say intellectually it can lead. Okay, the instinct I think of the scientific one is to break things down to their part, to like all these, you know, these big tunnels where they're smashing all the business, to get down to the smallest particles. Well, that's a position of many of the Indian schools, and this is where much of the teachings in Buddha are arguing with that you cannot find logically, you cannot find a partless particle. This is one of the major teachings about emptiness. You can't find such a thing. That whatever you posit has to be, the moment you posit it, even if it's the millionth of a millionth of a millionth of a millisecond, it still has to be continued to break down into more parts. You can never come to the fundamental starting point, which is the concept. There's got to be something there that's the source. That's a philosophical position, Buddha says, and he would disagree with it. Do you understand what I'm saying? So we're saying it now, we're discussing it now. So, and this is where, like his question, this is the classic conflict, the classic contradiction that we can't help but hear. So, in the Heart Sutra, I wanted to read the Heart Sutra. Have we got copies of the Heart Sutra? Let's get them out. We'll maybe read them after lunch or something. Read it after lunch. So in the Heart Sutra, which is in the perfection of wisdom teaching. So actually, wisdom itself, emptiness itself, is a Hinayana teaching, a Theravada teaching. You need to realize that to get your own nirvana. But it's taught in the Mahayana path in the context of the Bodhisattva path. So it's called the perfection of wisdom. So it's taught as one of the perfections of the Bodhisattva. So the Heart Sutra is basically, is stating within emptiness, it says, there is no this, no that, no this, no that, no this, no that. So as soon as we hear the word, there is no this, there's no self, there's no good, there's no bad, up, there's no down, we instantaneously mishear it. So the way to really comprehend this, and this is the way I want to present the teachings on emptiness, is that the marvelous one, which is Tsongkhapa's expertise, is to present in context of what's called the two truths, the two facts. The fact of conventional existence and the fact of ultimate. So the conventional and the ultimate. So the shorthand for conventional existence is the term dependent arising, or you hear it sometimes dependent origination. The shorthand for the ultimate or the final way of things' existence is the term emptiness. So clearly this is like shorthand. If you go relativity, you've not studied Einstein, you're going to go, oh yeah, I see relativity. What's it mean? Oh, I have no idea. It's shorthand. And if you've got all the knowledge, you know what it's referring to, isn't it? It's true, it's obvious. So these are the terms. So without background, without thinking it through, we can grotesquely misunderstand these. And we can be forgiven for misunderstanding it. Because in the Heart Sutra, it says, there is no this, there is no that. That sounds like, oh, well, there is no self. Okay, fair enough. And we hear the Buddha says, there is no Atma. So but we've got to know what he means by that. It's far more nuanced than the words seem to convey to our minds. So we've got to really think it through carefully. This is why it's really the best way to comprehend the ultimate truth, quote unquote, is within the context of relative or conventional truth, as they call it. The viewpoint that we're discussing here, like I said, the one I'm referring to, is the viewpoint within the Buddhist teachings. There are two main divisions in the Buddhist teachings, the Theravadan teachings, or known often as the Hinayana teachings. And then you've got the Mahayana teachings. So there are various viewpoints in the Hinayana, various philosophical positions. I mean, they probably, for example, there's one in the world that we know as Theravadan. Well, that's the one remaining of the 18 sub-schools of one of those schools of thought. They're highly subtle, fine points of difference. The difference is here, and this is what's fascinating, I would suggest, between the modern views of philosophy, the modern materialist views of philosophy, and these Indian and Buddhist ones, is that they are intellectual, but they have to be experienced internally. This is where I would suggest the major difference between the scientific views, the materialist scientific views, the massive difference, I would suggest, the massive difference, and including even in the philosophical positions in the materialist world. That the scientific ones, you can be the most genius scientist to work out the subtlest understanding of quantum physics, but you can still go home and beat up your wife because it doesn't touch your mind. And that's the massive difference. And this is what I find fascinating. Some philosophers in the modern world do talk about being experiential, but I remember Jeffrey Hopkins, this American professor, who was also one of His Holiness's first translators into English, He started this the first Asian studies, meaning Tibetan Buddhist studies, in an American university in South Carolina in 1976. And he was the first Buddhist practitioner, that's the point, who was also a philosopher and a scholar, a practitioner. And he said he was looked down upon by his fellow philosophers because the whole Socratic tradition, which is the philosophical positions of the modern Christian Jewish world, tracking back to the Greeks and the Romans. That's why in the modern European world, the world I come from, we know nothing about the Indians. We know all about the Greeks and the Romans. We think they're the ants pants, Do you understand? So it's these amazing Indians, they're invisible to us in the West. paying no attention to the Indians, you know. Positions, philosophical views. So it's the Greeks and the Romans. And that Socratic kind of philosophical position is one where you have an open mind, you open yourself to all kinds of ideas, but you stay objective, and there's never an end result. Now, I find that like completely nightmarish. Thinking for its own sake. I mean, how bizarre, you know. And then the worst thing you do scientifically, so he was even, Hopkins said to me that he was seen as like phony because he was being subjective. You're supposed to be objective. So you'd never dare practice a philosophy. Well, excuse me, that's a bit schizophrenic, isn't it? That's like saying you learn all these marvellous recipes of how to make a cake, but you'd never dare make a cake. That's too subjective. Or you'd learn all these theoretical positions about music, but you'd never play the piano. I mean, you'd be called a phony if you did that. And I think that's because, it's my own opinion, the way we think of thoughts in the materialist world is like this special private world that we're allowed to have as many thoughts as we like, and they don't necessarily have any impact upon how you live your life. I mean, that's, for me, is schizophrenic, actually. But that's how we think in the modern scientific world. So science is amazing, but the Buddhist point is, if it doesn't impact, if it's not rooted in morality and ethics, and this is where it's dangerous in the materialist world, because that sounds like religion. There's a dangerous one. So you don't dare, even psychology in the West would never dare talk about morality and ethics. That sounds like religion. So it's a very interesting point is what I'm suggesting. The Buddhist one is you can't possibly separate any body of knowledge up here from experience. If you can, it's faulty. It's just intellectual nonsense, you know. So I find that very compelling. And that's why I find it so important to remember the Buddhist view about morality. It's not, see, that's again the view, I think, that's so implicit in the materialist modern world, that morality and ethics is like religion. It's a polite word for religion. And religion is coming from a creator, and that means information coming from on high, and that's something you have to believe because you can't prove it. That's the view that's assumed in our mind, I think. So we think science is separate because it's not coming from on high, it's natural law. Well, guess what? Buddha says there is only natural law. There's no such thing as God's law. There's man's law, that's fine. Not going through the red lights, that's a man-made law. But there's no concept in Buddhism of God's law. There's no creator. Buddha says, that's why Buddha says everything can be proved. That's why Buddha's a scientist. I'm not joking here. It's just that his view of the mind goes more subtle than our materialist view. And he says basically, as His Holiness said, he says this repeatedly to us in the West. If you follow Buddha's methodology, each step, and you get to a point, and you're proving it each step as you go, that's what you do with knowledge. You don't just stuff it in your head and say you believe in it. That's ridiculous. You go each step of the way, and then you get to a certain point where you actually can prove that Buddha's wrong, then you must reject him. That's the view in Buddhism. But it's hard to hear this because we think of it as religion imposed upon us, a belief system. So Buddha's exactly a scientist. I'm not being sarcastic here. It has to be provable. If it's not, it doesn't exist. This is Buddha's point, finally. That's his point, finally. It's kind of interesting to hear this, you know. Okay, so let's look at this view. This is the view presented in the Mahayana view, not the Theravadan. There are so many viewpoints, but not only the only one in the Mahayana, there are several views there too, finer points, they all have a debate with each other. Finally, it's the view that's called the Mahayana view, which is called the middle way view, which is particularly the middle way consequentialist. There's a logic to that view as well, the reason why they use that term, but never mind now. So this is the view that we're discussing in this room. It's the only one I know about. I haven't studied the others enough, because I haven't done enough extensive study, but this one I can talk about. So, okay, what's it say? Like I said, every single word we've said so far this week, every word we've said this morning so far is leading inexorably to this. It's utterly linked. And you could argue that there's no way we can really begin to comprehend the two truths. There's no way we can begin to comprehend emptiness until we understand the Buddhist model of the mind, which is how we've been discussing all week, and until we understand how karma works. Because these are the two main things that get our mind ready to understand the two truths. Okay. So first of all, like I said before, we have to, before we begin to discuss how things exist, we have to first establish conventionally what exists. Just like I said before about a cup or a mind. We have to all be on the same page, pretty reasonable. So let's discuss, so there's different phenomena. Conventionally speaking, conventional truth or conventional facts, There's trillions of phenomena in the universe. Trillions. We can see this. So to discuss all of them, how they exist, we need to first establish what they are and all be on the same page. Pretty obvious. A cup is this, a microphone is that, a camera is this, a cushion is that. Well, there's a certain phenomenon, there are certain phenomena called persons, or person, or a self, or an I. These are synonymous. Now we know that we are one of those phenomena. We're not a cup, we're not a camera, we're not a toilet, we're not a cushion, we're a person. So conventionally, we're known as a person, an I, or a self. These are synonymous, or me, you could say me as well. They're all synonymous. So a Buddha is a person, a dog is a person, a cat is a person, a hell being. Buddha would assert beings we can't see with our eyes, but he would assert them, we can discuss, a being who is a hell being. They're all persons, they're eyes, they're selves. It's a conventional word. So this is why I get confused when we hear the Buddha says there's no self. Because that particular word, the Indian word or whatever, Atman, right? Atman, yeah, that's the word, isn't it? Okay. So that's also used in many other ways besides referring to a person. It's a type of way of existing, but we won't go into the details of that. So here, conventionally speaking, we are a person. We are a self. We are a being, okay? So let's now once we establish, we accept that that term refers to each one of us, let's now look at how a person exists. How do we exist? This is the job. This is the point. So dependent arising is the shorthand for the way Buddha says things exist conventionally. And what it means is, another word for dependent arising is the word interdependence. So we know this word is really a casually used and as an obvious meaning in our ordinary daily life. We all know that everything, generally speaking, we can agree with by looking, that everything that we know about exists interdependently. You know, the simplest one is a flower. We all can say the main cause of a flower would be the seed. Pretty obvious. You've got to get a rose seed. But we know perfectly well, you just don't hold up a rose seed in the sky and know that a rose will come. Nothing will happen until you put the other factors together that it depends upon in order to turn into a rose. You can't separate the rose seed. You can point out the rose seed, then you point out the water, then you point out the sun, and then you point out the soil. And you put all those together, and guess what? Somehow a magical little rose comes. So clearly it's a thing that exists. A rose is a thing that exists in dependence upon a series of causes. Well, this is called the law of cause and effect. It's hardly surprising. We call that science, you know. And this is what Buddha's saying. So there's 3 levels here in dependent arising. There are 3 levels that he points out mainly in which things exist in dependence upon. And these also happen to be 3 arguments he's stating with different positions in some of the Indian views that he diverged from. The first one is arguing with a view that says that there is an entity that doesn't have a cause. Now, this is the Christian teaching too. God does not have a cause. That's like insulting God. God, by definition, is this superior being that doesn't have a cause. Well, Buddha's arguing with that and says anything in the universe that exists, including an enlightened being, including a Buddha, necessarily must be a product of the law of cause and effect. But that's seen as almost like an insult, because God is above this reified idea of a creator who doesn't have a cause. So the very first level that Buddha teaches dependent arising is that everything exists in dependence upon causes. Guess what? Now this already is super tasty as a discussion in our own mind to counteract the feeling of the poor, self-pity, unhappy little me, which is the energy of ego. Look at how we feel when we're insulted, offended, hurt, are lonely. Bad things happen. The feeling of I, wouldn't we agree, you know? is somehow we even say in the West, well, it's not my fault. I didn't ask to get born. It's a profound statement. That's what we feel. Like, I didn't, and it's really true. If you think that your mother, I mean, I joke about this and it sounds hilarious, but this is the materialist view, that we are the product of mummy and daddy. Mummy and daddy hop into bed, and they can be deluded idiots. No one stops them. It's the only job you don't have to be qualified to do is have a baby. It seems to be the one job you should be qualified to do. Maniacs can have babies, you know. And then the belief in the West is, the scientific view is that they actually create another little version of themselves. Well, I think that's about the most fascist thing I've ever heard in my life. I mean, it's like a monster. It's like Frankenstein making a monster. But we all think it's scientific. Buddha says, don't be ridiculous. Your mother and father didn't make you. I mean, it's shocking to hear this for materialists. It's a shocking concept. We totally believe, well, excuse me, I didn't ask to get born. That's the materialist view. But look, that's what we feel. Even if you don't study science, let's say you never learned that mummy and daddy made you. That's what you feel. I didn't ask to get born. That means it's not my fault. Now look how ego is. When we're attacked, offended, accused, the first instinct of ego is, I didn't do it. It's not fair. Don't blame me. And we'll find every way possible to get off the hook, to get out of it. That's natural. That's what everyone does. Look at our mind. That's the way we feel about this poor little I in there. There's no cause. Now look what happens when people harm you. This is a classic one. The materialist view, the scientific view, says that your mother and father made you. Now that means you began in your mother's womb. Now, excuse me here, the Christian teaching, and maybe the Hindu teaching about God, is, you have the view of karma, that's different. Let's just talk about the Christian one. That you began in your mother's womb, and God put your soul there. So in both cases, is it not true, philosophically speaking, I began in my mother's womb. Now, if someone comes along and steals from me, and I've never met them before, you are really accurate and correct to say, how dare you steal from me? I don't deserve it. Is that not how we instinctively feel? Even if you have the view of karma, isn't that not how we instinctively feel? It's not fair. How dare you say that about me? Is that not how we feel? Well, you see, that's why you can't blame your mother for making you feel guilty. Buddha says that's a function of this ego grasping, this root delusion. The root delusion, Buddha refers to it as maripa, unawareness. It's the subtlest, most primordial lie in the mind that gives rise to this craving and attachment to get what the supposed I wants, which then causes anger and all the other dramas. There's like this hierarchy of these neuroses under the heading negative states of mind, deluded states of mind, afflictions, disturbing emotions. They're all synonymous. This is Buddha's deal in Buddhist psychology, which we should learn first. So the root delusion, as they refer to it, is this simply called ignorance. But it's known colloquially as ego grasping, self-grasping, a grasping at a little poor, self-pity, bereft, lonely, independent me who didn't ask to get born, to whom bad things happen unfairly, and who craves for good things. This is the way of describing how we feel about I, but we never unpack it. So we start to listen to the way we feel and hear the thoughts. We can hear this. This is the philosophy. This is the philosophy of this ego grasping, this innocent victim who didn't ask to get born, whose fault it is not, to whom bad things happen unfairly. So when we say in the world, and this is reinforced by the materialist view, that you didn't ask to get born, it's really true. Your mother and father, my mother and father never consulted me. This is why the materialist view for me is like hilarious. Ridiculous. I'm not trying to sound fundamentalist here, but hear my point. As a philosophical position, it's an insane view. And my feeling is if your mother and father really did make you, this is logical for me, this is scientific logic. If my mother and daddy decided to make Robina and give her anger and give her depression and give her jealousy, which is what our science says, I find that monstrous. If that's the case, you had better blame your parents. And you go to your therapist and they tell you should forgive them and stop blaming them. I disagree. I think if your mother and father made you, they are the blame and you should sue them to the hilt. I'm not joking here. I'm not even being sarcastic. It sounds hilarious, I know. But this is logical deduction. If you are the handiwork of your mummy and daddy, which is what the scientists say. But then they get the Hitlers of the world and they just throw their hands in the air and go, oh, well, we can't find the cause there. That's a bit extreme, you know. Or the Mother Teresa's for that matter. So I'm just trying to be logical here, looking at the philosophical positions, you know. Are we communicating here? Scientists among you? Am I communicating here? Okay. So, Buddha says, they didn't make you, Robina. They just kindly gave you a body. Yeah, they're a bit maniac, I agree with you, honey. But guess what? You created the cause to have a maniac mummy and a maniac daddy. You created the cause. You know, they were lying there having sex and you come barging in, so don't blame them. That's Buddha's view, you know. And you can't, I mean, equally I find, that's why the Christian view I find really a problem. Really a serious problem. That God can make me and then somehow give me free will, which is what they say, and then I turn bad, and then he sends me to hell. I think it's a really cruel concept. I can't work it out, you know, for me. I'm very sorry. Speaking simply, you know. So anyway, thinking about karma then, what I'm getting at here is this. Thinking about the law of karma is the most powerful way to apply this first level of dependent arising to counteract the self-pity me, which is what Lama Yeshe calls ego, which is I didn't ask to get born, it's not my fault, how dare you do that to me. I mean, look at anger. Listen to the philosophy of anger. Like I said before, everything is in the mental consciousness. It's a story the mind makes up. Well, so is anger. What is anger? What does anger say? Listen to the philosophy of anger. Anger says, how dare you do that to me? I don't deserve it. That's the philosophy of anger. It's a misconception. That's why I love to quote always this, you know, in 2003, Richard Gere, as you know, is a good Buddhist. He invited His Holiness to New York. And at the time I was running Liberation Prison Project, had been doing it for, you know, since 94 or whatever it was, 96 or something. So he decided he was negotiating to see if we could work together on working with prisoners, but he didn't, in the end it didn't happen. But what he did was he invited 20 former prisoners, Americans, to come for the day, have a discussion. People like me were invited, and we had a really moving day. You know, the black, white, male, female, Puerto Rican, Mexican, a whole cross-section of Americans, all of whom had done some kind of meditation in prison. So it was a very moving day, all discussing their problems and everything, you know. So then what happened was he also invited 2 young Tibetan nuns. You know, who'd been sexually abused and tortured in prison. So these young women were telling their story. So of course we know in this room, especially if you're Tibetan too, you know they've got the view of karma. Since they're born, in the bones of their being is the view of karma. It's just a world view. Like I was born in a Catholic country, not a Catholic country, Christian country, but materialist. So in my bones was the view, I didn't ask to get born, it's my mother's fault, my father's fault. It's just natural, it's so deep inside us, which we never question. So this is their default view, you know, and they're little practitioners. So what was shocking, I think, for all the Americans, first of all, was you could probably have argued that these young women's suffering, if you like, was probably more than everybody else's, if you can quantify suffering. But the other point that was shocking, I think, for the Americans, was they weren't angry. Now, in the West, in modern psychology, there's no trust that you can't have anger. You've got to have anger. It's natural because the view says anger's natural and anger is a good response that makes you have a self-respect or whatever, you know, because in the modern view, the materialist view of the mind, it's a beyond shocking to hear what Buddha's saying. Because Buddha's saying that all these neurotic states of mind are adventitious. Now, that's not a word I use in my daily life. So you get your dictionary and you're going to find that it means they're not integral to who I am. They're not at the core of my being. And there's a massively powerful point. This is beyond shocking in modern psychology. Because the default view of all the scientific views, the neuroscientific views, the psychological views, which are all basing the view that the mind is the brain, the view there is that anger is natural, jealousy is natural, fear is natural. Mr. Darwin invented the concept of instinct for survival. These are natural, meaning that you'd be unnatural if you didn't have them. So anyone who gets tortured but doesn't have anger, instantaneously modern psychology would completely say that they're delusional, that they're not natural. That's why you hear starkly like this, Buddha's view, that you can get rid of all these delusions, that's what he means by nirvana. It's insane. It's an insane concept. It's shocking to hear it. It's radical. Because we don't read it like this, we read it as not holy words, you know. So it's important to hear this. And then, of course, to understand the logic of Buddha's view. It's quite shocking. So these young women weren't angry. Because they had the view of karma, obviously. I remember another story, I haven't finished this story yet, but another one. You know, a friend of mine, Jigdol, a monk, who'd been a monk in Tibet, he said his mother and father decided to make many Tibetans. They had 13 babies, you know. So in 87, kind of the first sort of mini uprising against the Chinese communists since 59, apparently. And it was all the young monks and nuns. They were the radicalised ones. So if you think of, you know, demonstrating and shouting, you think of anger. The normal worldly view would be they were angry. So anyway, Jigdol told me how he got arrested, then he got tortured, then he got released, and then he had demonstrated again, then his friend had his head blown off, and then he thought he'd better escape, you know. So he came to Nepal. This is like a long time ago, he told me. So when he was telling me his story, there were tears. And I said to him, do you ever get angry? And his answer was exactly like this. He laughed casually and said, Robina, angry? What for? It's our own fault. Now, in materialist view, those words, it's our own fault, is beyond shocking. You know, it's like too terrible for words. But it just meant because he's internalised the view of karma. So when you've internalised the view of karma, why would you get angry? Because anger says, how dare you do that to me? I don't deserve it. Or karma says, you do. I'm very sorry. It's very simple. We understand this. If you looked in your bank account and you saw there were no dollars in it, you wouldn't say, how dare there be no dollars in my bank account? I don't deserve this. Well, excuse me, have you worked hard? Then if you haven't worked hard, then you do deserve to have no dollars. We know this. We would never say that. If you look at your garden and it's all full of weeds, who put weeds in my garden? I don't deserve this. How silly. You wouldn't say that. Well, that's the view of karma. That's why karma is so fundamentally necessary. Not just to have the view, oh yeah, I believe in karma, like a big stick coming back to whack you. It's a logical, marvellous, sophisticated presentation of how we are the creators of our own reality, including our happiness. It's an amazing view. I knew when I first heard the term karma, when I first heard Lama Zopa teaching the Lam Rim, it was 40 years ago this June, it's my 40th anniversary as a Buddhist. I did not have a clue what he was saying for that 1 month. It was an intensive 1 month course. I went every day. I was so happy to find it. I felt after my 32 years I finally found what I wanted. I didn't have a clue what he was saying. I swear, but I stayed along. I stuck in there, you know. So anyway, I heard the word karma, and that was about one word I could get. And I thought, that's something I want to know about. And for me, this has been the fundamental basis of my practice as a Buddhist. Absolutely. Without it, it's like Buddhism's like a joke. Most of the West thinks Buddhism's like being mindful. Watching your boring old breath. What a ridiculous idea. It's embarrassing to even hear it that way. I never watch my breath. People are shocked by that. I never watching my breath in 40 years. A couple of times I might do it. Doesn't mean I don't change my mind. Doesn't mean I don't practice Buddhism. Doesn't mean I don't, meditate every day. Just we have these cliched ideas of meditation, watching your boring old breath. So cliched, it's embarrassing. Anyway, karma. So this is my friend, Jigdol. The other one, these nuns, back to these nuns, he was talking to these Americans and they were listening quietly, and then at the end, with tears in their eyes, and they said very quietly, and of course, we had compassion for our torturers because we knew we must have harmed them in the past. I mean, it's the view of karma, So what I'm getting at here is this. Junior school, we learn about karma. But now, when we start to learn about emptiness, the first level of dependent arising is that, guess what? This I is the product of past causes, guess created by whom? This I. Conventionally. And now you've got egg on your face. Okay, it's my garden, it's my bank account, I better take responsibility. That's the first step. This is applying the law of cause and effect as a logical argument to smash the feeling of the innocent victim, which is the way that the grossest level that ego works at. So it's profound. And if you haven't studied karma in junior school, how can you study dependent arising? Now, the first level of it is causes and conditions. That the Buddha is saying there's nothing in the impermanent universe, including an enlightened being, including a superior being, including omniscience, including the qualities of an enlightened being, that isn't the product of causes. That's his first argument against the view that God or something up there is not caused. That's his first argument against one of the philosophical positions, including the self or the soul. First point. Now the second level of dependent arising, which also is arguing with another position, a more subtle position, that one of the characteristics of that causeless being or a soul is it doesn't have parts. This one, the one she mentioned, breaking down all the particles to get to the partless particle. Fundamental teaching in Buddhism. There can't be such a thing as a partless particle. There cannot be anything that exists that can't be broken down further. It seems so merely intellectual, but it's profound experientially. This is the second argument about dependent arising.